And so, my boy, first of all, I must once more and in greater detail repeat that our endlessness was forced to create the whole world which now exists at the present time. In the beginning, when nothing yet existed, and when the whole of our universe was empty, endless space with the presence of only the prime source cosmic substance, ethereal our present most great and most holy Son Absolute existed alone in all this empty space. And it was on this then sole cosmic concentration that our unibeing Creator with his cherubim and seraphim had the place of his most glorious being. It was just during the same period of the flow of time that there came to our Creator, all maintainer, the forced need to create our present existing megalocosmos, i.e., our world. From the third most sacred canticle of our cherubim and seraphim, we were worthy of learning that our Creator omnipotent once ascertained that this same Son Absolute on which he dwelt with his cherubim and seraphim was, although almost imperceptibly, yet nevertheless gradually, diminishing in volume. As the fact ascertained by him appeared to him very serious, he then decided immediately to review all the laws which maintain the existence of that then still sole cosmic concentration. During this review, our omnipotent Creator for the first time made it clear that the cause of his gradual diminishing of the volume of the Son Absolute was merely the heropass, that is, the flow of time itself. Thereupon our endlessness became thoughtful, for in his divine deliberations he became clearly aware that if this heropass should so continue to diminish the volume of the Son Absolute, then sooner or later it would ultimately bring about the complete destruction of the sole place of his being. And so, my boy, in view of this, our endlessness was then just compelled to take certain corresponding measures so that from this heropass the destruction of our most holy Son Absolute could not eventually occur. Further, again, from the sacred canticle of our cherubim and seraphim, but this time the fifth sacred canticle, we were worthy of learning that after this divine ascertainment of his, our endlessness devoted himself entirely to finding a possibility of averting such an inevitable end, which had to occur according to the lawful common commands of the merciless heropass, and that after his long divine deliberations, he decided to create our present existing megalocosmos. In order that you may more clearly understand how our endlessness decided to attain immunity from the maleficent action of his merciless heropass, and of course how he ultimately actualized it all, you must first of all know that before this, the most holy Son Absolute was maintained and existed on the basis of the system called autoegocrat, i.e., on that principle according to which the inner forces which maintain the existence of this cosmic concentration had an independent functioning, not depending on any forces proceeding from outside, and which were based also on those two fundamental cosmic sacred laws by which at the present time also the whole of our present megalocosmos is maintained, and on the basis of which it exists, and namely on the basis of those two fundamental primordial sacred cosmic laws called the sacred heptaparaparshinokh and the sacred triamazikamno. About both of these fundamental cosmic primordial sacred laws I have already once told you a little. Now, however, I shall try to explain to you about them in rather more detail. The first of these fundamental primordial cosmic sacred laws, namely the law of heptaparaparshinokh, present-day objective cosmic science, by the way, formulates in the following words: the line of the flow of forces constantly deflecting according to law and uniting again at its ends. The sacred primordial cosmic law has 7 deflections, or, as it is still otherwise said, 7 centers of gravity, and the distance between each 2 of these deflections or centers of gravity is called the stopinder of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh. This law, passing through everything newly arising and everything existing, always makes its completing processes with its 7 stopinders. And in regard to the second primordial fundamental cosmic law, and namely the sacred triamazikamno, common cosmic objective science also formulates with the words: a new arising from the previously arisen through the harnomiasno, the process of which is actualized thus: the higher blends with the lower in order to actualize the middle, and thus becomes either higher for the preceding lower or lower for the succeeding higher. And as I already told you, the sacred triamazikamno consists of 3 independent forces, which are called the first, Serp Otheos, the second, Serp Skiros, the third, Serp Athanatos, which three holy forces of the sacred triamazikamno, the said science calls as follows. The first, the affirming force, or the pushing force, or simply the force plus. The second, the denying force, or the resisting force, or simply the force minus. And the third, the reconciling force, or the equilibrating force, or the neutralizing force. At this place of my explanations concerning chiefly the fundamental laws of world creation and world maintenance, it is interesting to notice, by the way, that the three-brained beings of this planet, which has taken your fancy, already began at that period when the consequences of your properties of the organ Kundabuffer were not yet crystallized in their common presences, to be aware of these three holy forces of the sacred triamazikamno, and then name them: the first, God the Father; the second, God the Son; and the third, God the Holy Ghost, and in various cases express the hidden meaning of them, and also their longing to have a beneficent effect from them for their own individuality by the following prayers. Sources of divine rejoicings, revolts, and sufferings, direct your actions upon us. Or, wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. Or, holy God, wholly firm, wholly immortal, have mercy on us. Now, my boy, listen further very attentively. And so, in the beginning, as I have already told you, our most holy Son Absolute was maintained by the help of these two primordial sacred laws. But then these primordial laws functioned independently, without the help of any forces whatsoever coming from outside, and this system was still called only the autoegocrat. And so, our all-maintaining endlessness decided to change the principle of the system of the functionings of both of these fundamental sacred laws, and namely, he decided to make their independent functioning dependent on forces coming from outside. And so, in consequence of the fact that for this new system of functioning of the forces which until then maintain the existence of the most holy Son Absolute, there were required outside of the Son Absolute corresponding sources in which such forces could arise and from which they could flow into the presence of the most holy Son Absolute, our almighty endlessness was just then compelled to create our now existing megalocosmos with all the cosmoses of different scales and relatively independent cosmic formations present in it. And from then on, the system which maintained the existence of the Son Absolute began to be called trogoautoegocrat. Our common Father, omnibeing endlessness, having decided to change the principle of the maintenance of the existence of this then still unique cosmic concentration and sole place of his most glorious being, first of all altered the process itself of the functioning of these two primordial fundamental sacred laws, and he actualized the greater change in the law of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh. These changes in the functioning of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh consisted in this: that in three of its stop-enders he altered the what are called subjective actions, which had been until then in the stop-enders in this respect, that in one he lengthened the law of conformable successiveness, shortened it in another, and in a third disharmonized it, and namely, with the purpose of providing the requisite inherency for receiving, for its functioning, the automatic affluence of all forces which were near, he lengthened the stop-ender between its third and fourth deflections. This same stop-ender of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh is just that one, which is still called the mechano-coinciding medel in, and the stop-ender which he shortened is between its last deflection and the beginning of a new cycle of its completing process. By this time shortening, for the purpose of facilitating the commencement of a new cycle of the completing process, he predetermined the functioning of the given stop-ender to be dependent only upon the affluence of forces obtained from outside through that stop-ender from the results of the action of that cosmic concentration itself in which the completing process of this primordial fundamental sacred law flows. And this stop-ender of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh is just that one, which is still called the intentionally actualized medel in. As regards the third stop-ender, then changed in its subjective action, and which is fifth in the general successiveness and is called harnel aut, its disharmony flowed by itself from the change of the two aforementioned stop-enders. This disharmony in its subjective functioning, flowing from its asymmetry, so to say, in relation to the whole entire completing process of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, consists in the following. If the completing process of the sacred law flows in conditions where during its process there are many extraneously caused vibrations, then all its functioning gives only external results. But if this same process proceeds in absolute quiet, without any external, extraneously caused vibrations whatsoever, then all the results of the action of its functionings remain within that concentration in which it completes its process, and for the outside, these results only become evident on direct and immediate contact with it. And if, however, during its functioning there are neither of these two sharply opposite conditions, then the results of the action of its process usually divide themselves into the external and the internal. Thus, from that time, the process of actualization began to proceed in the greatest as well as in the smallest cosmic concentrations with these stop-enders of this primordial sacred law of heptaparaparshinokh, changed in this way in their subjective actions. I repeat, my boy, try very hard to understand everything that will relate to both these fundamental cosmic sacred laws, since knowledge of these sacred laws, particularly knowledge relating to the particularities of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, will help you in the future to understand very easily and very well the second grade and third grade laws of world creation and world existence. Likewise, an all-around awareness of everything concerning these sacred laws also conduces in general to this, that three-brained beings, irrespective of the form of their exterior coating, by becoming capable in the presence of all cosmic factors not depending on them and arising round about them, both the personally favorable as well as the unfavorable, of pondering on the sense of existence, acquiring data for the elucidation and reconciliation in themselves of that what is called individual collision, which often arises in general in three-brained beings from the contradiction between the concrete results flowing from the processes of all the cosmic laws and the results presupposed and even quite surely expected by their what is called sane logic, and thus correctly evaluating the essential significance of their own presence, they become capable of becoming aware of the genuine corresponding place for themselves in these common cosmic actualizations. In short, the transmutation in themselves of an all-around understanding of the functioning of both these fundamental sacred laws conduces to this, that in the common presences of three-brained beings, data are crystallized for engendering that divine property which it is indispensable for every normal three-brained being to have, and which exists under the name of semuniranus. Of this, your favorites have also an approximate representation, and they call it impartiality. And so, my dear boy, our common Father, Creator Almighty, having then in the beginning changed the functioning of both these primordial sacred laws, directed the action of their forces from within the most holy Son Absolute into the space of the universe, whereupon there was obtained the what is called emanation of the Son Absolute, and now called theomertmalogos, or Word God. For the clarity of certain of my future explanations, it must be remarked that, in the process of the creation of the now existing world, the divine willpower of our endlessness participated only at the beginning. The subsequent creation went on automatically, of its own accord, entirely without the participation of his own divine willpower, thanks only to these two changed fundamental primordial cosmic laws. And the process itself of creation proceeded then in the following successiveness. Thanks to the new particularity of the fifth stop-ender of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, these emanations issuing from the Son Absolute began to act at certain definite points of the space of the universe upon the prime source cosmic substance ethereal from which, owing to the totality of the former and the new particularities of the sacred primordial laws, certain definite concentrations began to be concentrated. Further, thanks to these factors and also to their own laws of heptaparaparshinokh and triamazikamno, which had already begun to arise in these definite concentrations with their action upon each other, everything which had to be gradually began to be crystallized in these concentrations, and as a result of all this, those large concentrations were obtained which exist also until now, and which we now call second-order suns. When these newly arisen suns had been completely actualized, and their own functionings of both the fundamental laws had been finally established in them, then in them also, similarly to the most holy Son Absolute, their own results began to be transformed and to be radiated, which together with the emanations issuing from the most holy Son Absolute into the space of the universe became the factors for the actualization of the common cosmic fundamental process of the sacred law of triamazikamno, and that is to say, the most holy theomertmalogos began to manifest itself in the quality of the third holy force of the sacred triamazikamno. The results of any one of the newly arisen second-order suns began to serve as the first holy force, and the result of all the other newly arisen second-order suns in relation to this mentioned one newly arisen sun as the second holy force of this sacred law. Thanks to the process of the common cosmic sacred triamazikamno, thus established in the space of the universe, crystallizations of different what is called density gradually began to be formed around each of the second-order suns out of that same prime source, ethereal krillno, and grouping themselves around these newly arisen suns, new concentrations began to take form, as a result of which more new suns were obtained, but this time third-order suns. These third-order concentrations are just those cosmic concentrations which at the present time are called planets. At this very place in the process of the first outer cycle of the fundamental sacred heptaparaparshinokh, namely, after the formation of the third-order suns or planets, just here, owing to the changed fifth deflection of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, which, as I have already said, is now called Harnel Out, the initially given momentum of the fundamental completing process, having lost half the force of its vivifyingness, began in its further functioning to have only half of the manifestation of its action outside itself, and the other half for itself, i.e., for its very own functioning. The consequences of which were that on these last big results, i.e., on these said third-order suns or planets, there began to arise what are called similarities to the already arisen. And as after this, surrounding conditions of actualizations were everywhere established corresponding to the manifestation of the second particularity of the fifth stopender of the fundamental sacred heptaparaparshinokh. Therefore, from then on, the actualization of the fundamental outer cycle of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh ceased, and all the action of its functioning entered forever into the results already manifested by it. And then there began to proceed its inherent permanent processes of transformation called evolution and involution. And then, thanks this time to a second-grade cosmic law, which is called Litzvirtzi, or the aggregation of the homogeneous, there began to be grouped on the planets themselves from the mentioned relatively independent new formations named similarities to the already arisen, yet other, also, relatively independent formations. Thanks just to these processes of evolution and involution inherent in the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, there also began to be crystallized and decrystallized in the presences of all the greatest and smallest cosmic concentrations, all kinds of definite cosmic substances with their own inherent subjective properties, and which objective science calls active elements. And all the results of the evolution and involution of these active elements, actualizing the trogoautoegocratic principle of existence of everything existing in the universe by means of reciprocal feeding and maintaining each other's existence, produced the said common cosmic process Iran Umanje, or as I have already said, what objective science calls common cosmic exchange of substances. And so, my boy, thanks to this new system of the reciprocal feeding of everything existing in the universe, in which our most holy Son Absolute itself participated, there was established in it that equilibrium which at the present time no longer gives the merciless hero pass any possibility of bringing about anything unforeseen whatsoever to our most great and most holy Son Absolute, and thus the modem for the divine anxiety of our almighty unibeing endlessness concerning the wholeness of his eternal place of dwelling disappeared forever. Here it is necessary to tell you that when this most wide divine actualization was finished, our triumphant cherubim and seraphim then gave, for the first time, to all the newly arisen actualizations those names which exist even until today, every relatively independent concentration in general, they then defined by the word cosmos. And to distinguish the different orders of arising of these cosmoses, they added to this definition, cosmos, a separate corresponding name. And namely, they named the most holy prime source, Son Absolute itself, protocosmos. Each new arisen second-order sun with all its consequent definite results they called deuterocosmos. Third-order suns, i.e. those we now call planets, there they call tritocosmos. The smallest relatively independent formation on the planets, which arose thanks to the new inherency of the fifth stopender of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, and which is the very smallest similarity to the whole, was called microcosmos. And finally, those formations of the microcosmos, in which also became concentrated on the planets, this time thanks to the second order cosmic law called mutual attraction of the similar, were named tetartocosmoses. And all these cosmoses, which together compose our present world, began to be called the megalocosmos. And then also, our cherubim gave names, also existing until now, to the emanations and radiations issuing from all these cosmoses of different scales, by means of which the process of the most great cosmic trogoautoegocrat proceeds. The emanation of the most holy Son Absolute itself they called, as I have already told you, theomertmalogos, or Word God. 2. The radiation of each separate second-order sun, mentakitzoin. The radiation of each planet separately they called dynamumzoin. That given off from the microcosmoses they call photoenzoin. The radiations issuing from the tetartocosmoses they called henbledzoin. The radiations of all the planets together of any solar system they called astroluolucosion. The common radiations of all the newly arisen second-order suns taken together they called polorotheopal, and all the results issuing from all the cosmic sources, great and small, taken together were also then named by then the common cosmic Ansan-Baluiazar. It is interesting to remark that concerning this common cosmic Ansan-Baluiazar, present-day objective science is also the formula, everything issuing from everything, and again entering into everything. Independent names were then given to all the, as they are called, temporarily independent crystallizations arising in each of the innumerable cosmoses by the evolutionary and involutionary processes of these fundamental sacred laws. I shall not enumerate the names of the large number of these independent centers of gravity, which became crystallized in all separate cosmoses, but shall indicate only the names of these definite center of gravity active elements, which became crystallized in each separate cosmos, and which have a direct relation with my following elucidations, and namely, those which are crystallized in the presences of tetartocosmoses, and have such a temporarily independent center of gravity. In tetartocosmoses, the following names were given to these independent arisings. 1. Protoeheri. 2. Dephthoroeheri. 3. Tridoeheri. 4. Tetartoeheri. 5. Pianjoeheri. 6. Exioeheri. 7. Rizolzerion. And now, my boy, after everything that I have elucidated to you, we can return to the question why and how higher being bodies, or as your favorites name them, souls, began to arise in our universe, and why our unibeing common Father turned his divine attention primarily to just these cosmic arisings. The point is that when the common cosmic harmonious equilibrium had become regularized and established in all those cosmoses of different scales, then in each of these tetartocosmoses, i.e. in each separate relatively independent formation of the aggregation of microcosmoses, which had its arising on the surface of the planets, the surrounding conditions on the surface of which accidentally began to correspond to certain data present in these cosmoses, owing to which they could exit for a certain period of time without what is called secruano, i.e. without constant individual tension, the possibility appeared of independent automatic moving from one place to another on the surface of the given planets. And thereupon, when our common Father Endlessness ascertained this automatic moving of theirs, there then arose for the first time in him the divine idea of making use of it as a help for himself in the administration of the enlarging world. From that time on, he began to actualize everything further for these cosmoses in such a direction that the inevitable what is called okrualno, i.e. the periodic repetition in them of the completing process of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, might be accomplished in such a way that, under conditions of a certain kind of change in the functioning of the common presences of some of these tetartocosmoses, there might be transformed and crystallized, besides the crystallizations which had to be transformed for the purpose of the new common cosmic exchange of substances, also those active elements from which new independent formations might be coded in themselves with the inherent possibility of acquiring individual reason. That this idea first arose just then in our endlessness, we can also see from the words of that sacred canticle with which at the present time at all divine solemnities our cherubim and seraphim extol the marvelous works of our Creator. Before continuing to relate further how this was actualized, it is necessary to tell you that the functioning of the mentioned common cosmic Aranuranumanji is harmonized in such a way that all the results obtained from transformations in different cosmoses localize themselves together according to what is called qualitativeness of vibrations, and these localizations penetrate everywhere throughout the universe and take a corresponding part in planetary as well as in surplanetary formations, and generally have as a temporary place of their free concentrations the what are called atmospheres with which all the planets of our megalocosmos are surrounded, and through which connection is established for the common cosmic Numanji. And so, the further results of this divine attention in respect of the mentioned tetrartocosmoses consisted in this, that during their serving as apparatuses for the most great cosmic trogoautoegocrat, the possibility was obtained in them that from among the cosmic substances transformed through them, both for the needs of the most great common cosmic sacred trogoautoegocrat, as well as for the supply of substances expended by them for the process of their own existence, and composed exclusively of cosmic crystallizations which are derived from the transformations of that planet itself on which the given tetrartocosmoses arose, such results began to be obtained in their common presences under the mentioned conditions, as proceeded from cosmic sources of a higher order, and consequently composed of what are called vibrations of greater vivifyingness. Now, from such cosmic results, exactly similar forms begin to be coded in their common presences, at first from the cosmic substances mentikitzoin, i.e., from the substances transformed by the sun and by other planets of that solar system within the limits of which the given tetrartocosmoses had the place of their arising, in which cosmic substances reach every planet through the radiations of the said cosmic concentrations. In this way, the common presences of certain tetrartocosmoses began beforehand to be composed of two different independent formations arisen from two entirely different cosmic sources, and these began to have a joint existence, as if one were placed within the other. And so, my boy, when similar codings of previously coded tetrartocosmoses were completed and began to function correspondingly, then from that time on they ceased calling them tetrartocosmoses and began to call them beings, which then meant two-natured, and these same second codings alone began to be called bodies kesgen. Now, when in this new part of these two-natured formations everything corresponding was acquired, and when all that functioning which it is proper to such cosmic arisings to have was fully established, then these same new formations in their turn, on exactly the same basis as in the first case, and also under the conditions of a certain kind of change of functioning, begin to absorb and assimilate into themselves such cosmic substances as had their arising immediately from the most holy theomertmalogos, and similarities of the third kind began to be coded in them, which are the higher sacred parts of beings, and which we now call higher being bodies. Further, when their higher being bodies were finally coded and all the surrounding functions had been acquired in them, corresponding functions had been acquired in them, and chiefly when it became possible for the data for engendering the sacred function, namely objective reason, to become crystallized in them, which data can become crystallized exclusively only in the presences of those cosmic arisings, and when what is called rasguarno occurred to these tetrartocosmoses or beings, i.e., the separation of these diverse natured 3-in-1 formations from each other. Only then did this higher being part receive the possibility of uniting itself with the cause of causes of everything now existing, i.e., with our most holy Son Absolute, and began to fulfill the purpose on which our all-embracing endlessness had placed his hope. Now, it is necessary to explain to you in more detail in what successiveness this first sacred Rasguarno then occurred to these first tetrartocosmoses, and how it occurs also now to the, as they are called, three-brain beings. At first on the planet itself, the second being body, i.e. the body Kesgen, together with the third being body, separate themselves from the fundamental planetary body, and leaving this planetary body on the planet, rise both together to that sphere where those cosmic substances from the localizations of which the body Kesgen of a being arises have their place of concentration. And only there, at the end of a certain time, does the principal and final sacred rasguarno occur to this two-natured being, after which such a higher being part indeed becomes an independent individual with its own individual reason. Previously, i.e., before the Chut God Latanical period, the sacred cosmic actualization was only after the second process of the sacred rasguarno, either thought worthy of uniting with the presences of our most holy Son Absolute, or when to other cosmic concentrations where such independent holy individuals were needed. And if at the moment of the approach of the final process of the sacred rasguarno, these cosmic arisings had not yet attained to the required gradation of reason of the sacred scale of reason, then this higher being part had to exist in the said sphere until it had perfected its reason to the required degree. It is impossible not to take notice here of that objective terror which occurs to the already risen higher being parts, who, owing to all results in new cosmic processes unforeseen from above, have not yet perfected themselves up to the necessary gradations of reason. The point is that according to various second-grade cosmic laws, the being body Kesgen cannot exist long in the sphere, and at the end of a certain time, the second being part must decompose, irrespective of whether the higher being part existing within it had by that time attained the requisite degree of reason. And in view of the fact that as long as this higher being part does not perfect its reason to the requisite degree, it must always be dependent upon some Kesgenian arising or other. Therefore, immediately after the second sacred rasguarno, every such still unperfected higher being body gets into a state called tekgekdinal, or searching for some other similar two-natured arisings corresponding to itself, so that when the higher part of this other two-natured arising perfects itself to the required degree of reason, and the final process of the sacred rasguarno occurs to it, and the speedy disintegration of the Kesgen body is not yet clearly sensed, this higher being body might instantly enter this other body Kesgen and continue to exist in it for its further perfection, which perfection must sooner or later be inevitably accomplished by every arisen higher being body. And that is why in the sphere to where the higher being part goes after the first sacred rasguarno, that process proceeds called Aukikolevnian exchange of the external part of the soul, or exchange of the former being body Kesgen. Here you might as well be told that your favorites also have, as it were, a similar representation about the Aukikolevnian exchange, and they have even invented a very clever name for it, namely metempsychosis, or reincarnation. And that branch of their famous science, which in recent centuries has been created around this question, also gradually became, and at the present already is, one of those minor maleficent factors, the totality of which is gradually making their reason, already strange enough without this, always more and more, as our dear Mullah Nasreddin would say, shurumurumnumnian. According to the fantastic branch of this theory of their science, now called spiritualism, they suppose, among other things, that each of them already has a higher being part, or as they call it, a soul, and that a transmigration must be occurring the whole time to this soul, i.e., something of the kind of the same Aukikolevnian exchange of which I have just spoken. Of course, if these unfortunates would only take into consideration that according to the second-grade cosmic law called Tenekdoa, or law of gravity, the same being part, if in rare cases it does happen, then it arises in them. Instantly it rises after the first rasguarno of the being, or as they express it, after the death of the being, from the surface of their planet. And if they understood that the explanations and proofs given by this branch of their science of all sorts of phenomenon which proceeded, as it were, among them, then their thanks to those fantastic souls of theirs were only the fruits of their idle fancy, then they would already realize that everything else proved by this interesting. Back over. Of course, if these unfortunates would only take into consideration that, according to the second-grade cosmic law called Tenekdoa, or law of gravity, the same being part, if in rare cases it does happen that it arises in them, instantly rises after the first rasguarno of the being, or as they express it, after the death of the being, from the surface of the planet. and if they understood that the explanations and proofs given by this branch of their science of all sorts of phenomena, which proceeded as it were among them their thanks to those fantastic souls of theirs, were only the fruits of their idle fancy, then they would already realize that everything else proved by this science of theirs is also nothing else but Mullah Nasreddin's twaddle. Now, as regards the first two lower being bodies, namely the planetary body and the body Kestion, then after the first sacred rasguarno of a being, his planetary body, being formed of microcosmoses or of crystallizations transformed on the planet itself, gradually decomposes and disintegrates there on that same planet, according to a certain second-grade cosmic law called Agin Tarno Tol Tur, into its own primordial substances from which it obtained its arising. As regards the second being body, namely the body Keshen, this body being formed of radiations of other concentrations of stratocosmoses and of the sun itself of the given solar system, and having entered after the second process of the sacred Rasguarno into the sphere just mentioned, also begins gradually to decompose, and the crystallizations of which it is composed go in various ways into the sphere of its own primordial arisings. But the higher being body itself, being formed of crystallizations received directly from the sacred theomertmalogos into the solar system within the limits of which the being arises and where his existence proceeds, can never decompose. And this higher part must exist in the given solar system as long as it does not perfect itself to the required reason, to just that reason, which makes similar cosmic formations what are called Iran Kipaik, i.e. such formations of the mentioned most sacred substances as can exist and be independent of Keschanian arisings, and at the same time not be subject to what are called painful influences from any external cosmic factors whatsoever. And so, my boy, as I have already told you, after these cosmic arisings have perfected their reason to the necessary gradation of the sacred scale of reason, they were in the beginning taken on to the Son Absolute for the fulfillment of roles predestined for them by our Creator Endlessness. It is necessary to tell you that concerning the determination of the degrees of individuality, our cherubim and seraphim also then at the very beginning of established that still now existing sacred determiner of reason, which is applied for the determination of the gradations of reason, or more exactly the totality of self-awareness, of all separate large and small cosmic concentrations, and by which not only are the gradations of their reason measured, but there is also determined there, as it is called, degree of justification of the sense and aim of their existence, and also the further role of each separate individual in relation to everything existing in our great megalocosmos. This sacred determinator of pure reason is nothing else than a kind of measure, i.e., a line divided into equal parts. One end of this line is marked as the total absence of any reason, i.e., absolute firm calm, and at the other end there is indicated absolute reason, i.e., the reason of our incomparable Creator Endlessness. In this place, I think it might as well be explained to you further about the various kinds of sources present in the common presences of all three-brained beings for the manifestation of being reason. In every three-brained being in general, irrespective of the place of his arising and the form of his exterior coating, there can be crystallized data for three independent kinds of being mentation, the totality of the engendered results of which expresses the gradation of his reason. Data for these three kinds of being reason are crystallized in the presence of each three-brained being, depending upon how much, by means of the being parktol duty, the corresponding higher being parts are coded and perfected in them, which should without fail compose their common presences as a whole. The first highest kind of being reason is the pure or objective reason, which is proper only to the presence of a higher being body, or to the common presences of the bodies themselves of those three-brained beings, in whom this higher part has already arisen and perfected itself, and then only when it is the what is called center of gravity initiator of the individual functioning of the whole presence of the being, the sacred being reason, which is called trogoautoegocrat, can be in the presences of those three-brained beings in whom their second being body, Keshen, is already completely coded and functions independently. As regards the third kind of being reason, this is nothing else but only the action of the automatic functionings which proceeds in the common presences of all beings in general, and also in the presences of all surplanetary definite formations, thanks to repeated shocks coming from outside, which evoke habitual reactions from the data crystallized in them corresponding to previous accidentally perceived impressions. Now, my boy, in my opinion, before going on to a more detailed explanation of how their higher parts were then coded and perfected in the common presences of the first heterocosmoses, as well as in the common presences of those who were afterwards named beings, it is necessary to give you more information about the fact that we, being arisen on the planet Caritas, and also the beings arisen on your planet called Earth, are already no longer such polormedictic beings as were the first beings who were transformed directly from the heterocosmoses, that is to say, beings called polormedictic, or as it is still now said, monoenithits, but are beings called Keshamartmanian, nearly half beings, owing to which the completing process of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh does not proceed at the present time through us or through your favorites, the three brain beings of the planet Earth, exactly as it proceeded in them, and we are such Keshamartnian beings because the last fundamental stopender of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, which at the present time almost all the beings of the megalocosmos call the sacred Ashagi Protoiheri, is not in the centers of those planets upon which we arise, as it occurs in general in the majority of the planets of our great megalocosmos, but is in the centers of their satellites, which for our planet Caritas is the little planet of our solar system which we call Purgatory, and for the planet Earth, its former fragments now called the Moon and Anulios. Thanks to this, the completing process of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, for the continuation of the species, for instance, proceeds not through one being, as it proceeded with the heterocosmoses, but through two beings of different sexes, called by us activus and passivus, and on the planet Earth, man and woman. I might say here that there even exists in our great megalocosmos a planet on which the sacred law heptaparaparshinokh carries out its completing process for the continuation of the species of the three brain beings through three independent individuals. You might as well be acquainted somewhat in detail with this common planet. This planet is called Modiktio and belongs to the system of the protocosmos. Beings arising on this planet are three-brained, like all other three-brained beings arising on all the planets of our great megalocosmos, and in their exterior appearances are almost similar to us, and at the same time are also so considered by all others the most ideal and perfect of all the innumerable various formed exterior coatings of three-brained beings in our great universe. And all our now existing angels, archangels, and most of the sacred individuals nearest to our common Father, endlessness, arise just upon this marvelous planet. This transformation through them of the cosmic substances required for the common cosmic trogoautoegocratic process, according to the sacred law heptaparaparshinokh, proceeds on these same principles on which it proceeds through our common presences and also through the presences of your favorites, the three-brained beings breeding on the planet Earth. For the continuation of their species alone does the sacred law affect its completing process through three kinds of beings, wherefore such three-brained beings are called triamazikamno. Separately, however, just as among us beings of different sexes are called activus and passivus, or are called on your planet man and woman, so there on the planet Modiktio they call the beings of the different sexes Martna, Spirna, and Okina. And although externally they are all alike, yet in their inner construction they are very different from each other. The processes of the continuation of their species proceeds among them in the following manner. All three beings of different sexes simultaneously receive the sacred El Muarno, or as your favorites say, conception, through a special action, and for a certain period they exist with the sacred El Muarno, or conception, apart from one another, entirely independently, but each of them exist with very definite intentional perceptions and cosmic manifestations. And later, when the time approaches for the manifestation of the results of these conceptions, or when, as your favorites say, the time of birth approaches, there becomes evident in all these three uncommon beings, as it is called, an aklono-atistician, longing for each other. Or as your favorites would say, there appears in them a physical organic attraction. And the nearer the time of this being manifestation or birth approaches, the more they press close to each other and ultimately almost grow onto each other. And thereupon at one and the same time, they actualize in a certain way these conceptions of theirs. And so, during their actualization of their conception, all these three conceptions merge one with another, and in this way there appears in our megalocosmos a new three-brained being of such an uncommon construction. And three-centered beings of this kind are ideal in our megalocosmos because at their very arising they already have all the being bodies. And they have all three being bodies because the producers of such a being, namely Martna, Smyrna, and Okina, each separately conceives the arising of one of the three being bodies, and owing to their special corresponding being existences, they aid the sacred heptaparaparshinokh to form the given being body in themselves to perfection, and afterwards, at the moment of appearance, merge it with the other bodies into one. Note, by the way, my boy, that the beings arising on that incomparable and marvelous planet have no need, like the three-brained beings arising on other ordinary planets of our megalocosmos, to coat their higher being bodies with the help of those factors which our Creator designed as means of perfecting, namely, those factors which we now call conscious labors and intentional suffering. Now, my boy, to continue the further, more detailed elucidation concerning the process of the transformation of cosmic substances through beings in general, we shall take as an elucidatory example of the common presences of your favorites. Although the process of the transformation of substances of the continuation of the species by means of us or by means of the common presences of your favorites does not proceed exactly as it proceeded in the first tetartocosmoses, who were transformed into beings. Nevertheless, we shall take them as an example, since the process itself of the transformation of cosmic substances for the needs of the most great common cosmic trogoautoegocrat proceeds through their common presences exactly as it proceeded through the first tetartocosmoses. At the same time, you will require information concerning several other small details of the strange particularities of their psyche, and also gain information relating to how they in general understand and how they regard their being duty in the sense of serving the common cosmic processes of Numanji, destroying for the beautification of their own belly every kind of law conformable for seeing actualization for the welfare of the whole megalocosmos. As for these particularities of the transformation of cosmic substances, thanks to which the continuation of the species of different beings at the present time proceeds differently, for the present I will say only this, that the cause depends on the place of concentration of the sacred Ashagi Prodaihari, i.e. on the place of concentrations of the cosmic substances, which are the results of the last up-inner in the common cosmic Ansanabalayazar. Now, my boy, I shall begin by repeating, all your favorites, even the contemporary, are like us, and like all the other three-centered beings of our megalocosmos, such apparatuses for the great cosmic trogoautoegocrat, just as the tetartocosmoses were, from whom arose the first ancestors of the now existing beings as well as the beings now existing everywhere. And through each of them, the cosmic substances arising in all seven stop-inners of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh could be transformed, and all of them, again even the contemporary, besides serving as apparatuses for the most great cosmic trogoautoegocrat, could have all possibilities for absorbing from those cosmic substances which are transformed through them what is corresponding for the coding and for the perfecting in them of both higher being bodies, because each three-brain being arisen on this planet of yours represents in himself also, in all respects, just as every three-brain being in all our universe, an exact similarity of the whole megalocosmos. The difference between each of them and our common great megalocosmos is only in scale. Here you should know that your contemporary favorites very often use a notion taken by them from somewhere, I do not know, either instinctively, emotionally, or automatically, and expressed by them in the following words: we are the images of God. These unfortunates do not even suspect that, of everything known to most of them concerning cosmic truths, this expression of theirs is the only true one of them all, and indeed, each of them is the image of God. not of that God which they have in their bobtailed picturings, but of the real God, by which word we sometimes still call our common megalocosmos. Each of them, to the smallest detail, is exactly similar, but of course in miniature, to the whole of our megalocosmos, and in each of them there are all of the separate functionings which in our common megalocosmos actualize the cosmic harmonious Iran Numanji, or exchange of substances, maintaining the existence of everything existing in the megalocosmos as one whole. The same expression of theirs, we are the images of God, can here serve us as a very good additional illustration and explanation of how far what is called perceptible logic, or as it is sometimes still said, amnofnian mentation, is already distorted in them. Although this expression corresponding to the truth exists there among them, yet concerning the consideration of its exact sense, as in general concerning every short verbal formulation, they at best always express with their strange short-sighted mentation, even if they should wish with their whole common presence actively and sincerely to reveal their inner representation and essential understanding of this expression of theirs, something as follows. Good. If we are images of God, that means God is like us and has an appearance also like us, and that means our God has the same mustache, beard, nose as we have, and he dresses also as we do. He dresses as we do, doubtless because like us he is also very fond of modesty. It was not for nothing that he expelled Adam and Eve from paradise, only because they lost their modesty and began to cover themselves with clothes. In certain of the beings there, particularly of recent times, their being amnofnian mentation, or perceptible logic, has already become such that they can very clearly see the same God of theirs in their picturings, almost with a comb sticking out of his left vest pocket, with which he sometimes combs his famous beard. Such a super peculiar being amnofnian mentation about their God proceeded in your favorites chiefly from the Hastamusian manifestations of those learned beings who, you remember, I have already told you, assembled in the city of Babylon and collectively began to invent various maleficent fictions concerning their God, which were afterwards by chance widely spread everywhere on that ill-fated planet. And in view of that fact, that period coincided with the time when the three-brained beings there began to exist, particularly selzelnualno, i.e. particularly passively, in the sense of the being efforts proper to the three-brained beings. Therefore, these maleficent inventions were thoroughly absorbed and appropriated by the beings. And afterwards, in their transmissions from generation to generation by inheritance, they gradually began to be crystallized into such monstrous logic-nestarian materials, with the result that in the psyche of the contemporary three-brained beings there began to proceed such an already exceptionally distorted being amnofnian mentation. And the reason that they pictured their God to themselves just with the long beard was due to the fact that then, among the maleficent inventions of the Babylon learned, it was said, among other things, that the famous God of theirs, as it were, the appearance of a very old man just with a heavy beard. But concerning the appearance of their God, your favorites have gone still further. Namely, they picture this famous God of theirs exactly as an old Jew, since in their bobtailed notions all sacred personages originated from that race. At any rate, my little Hussein, each of your favorites separately is in his whole presence exactly similar in every respect to our megalocosmos. I once told you that there is localized in the head of each one of them, as well as in us, a concentration of corresponding cosmic substances, all the functioning of which exactly corresponds to all those functions and purposes which our most holy protocosmos has and fulfills for the whole of the megalocosmos. This localization, which is concentrated in their head, they called the head brain. The separate, what are called okaniaki, or protoplasts, or of this localization on their head, or as the terrestrial learned call them, the cells of the head brain, actualized for the whole presence of each of them exactly such a purpose as is fulfilled at the present time by the higher perfected bodies of three-brained beings from the whole of our great universe, who have already united themselves with the most holy Son Absolute, or protocosmos. When these higher being when these higher parts of the three brain beings, who are perfected to the corresponding gradation of objective reason, get there, they fulfill precisely that function of the okaniaki, or cells of the head brain, for which function, as I have already said, our unibeing common Father Endlessness condescended at the creation of the now existing world to decide to use for the future those codings who obtain independent individuality in the tetrartocosmoses as an aid for himself in the administration of the enlarging world. Further, in each of them, in their what is called vertebral column, another concentration was localized, called there the spinal marrow, in which there are precisely those what are called denying sources, which actualize in their functionings in relation to the parts of the head brain just such fulfillments as the second order newly arisen sons of the megalocosmos actualize in relation to the most holy protocosmos. It must without fail be noticed that in former epochs there on your planet, your favorites knew something about the separate particular functioning of the parts of their spinal marrow, and they even knew and adopted various mechanical means for action upon corresponding parts of the spinal marrow of theirs, during those periods when some disharmony or other appeared in their, as they express it, psychic state. But the information relating also to this kind of knowledge gradually evaporated, and although your contemporary favorites know that certain particular concentrations are in the spinal marrow of theirs, yet of course they have not the slightest notion for what function they were designed by great nature, and in most cases simply name them brain nodes of their spinal marrow. Well then, just these separate brain nodes of their spinal marrow are the sources of denial in relation to the separate shades of affirmation in their head brain, precisely as the separate second-order sons as the sources of the various shades of denial in relation to the various shades of affirmation of the most holy protocosmos. And finally, just as in the megalocosmos, all the results obtained by the flow of the fundamental process of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh from the affirmation of the most holy protocosmos, and from the various shades of denial of the newly created sons began to serve thereafter as a reconciling principle for everything newly arising and already existing, so in them also there is a corresponding localization for the concentration of all results obtained from the affirmation of head brain and from all the shades of denial of the spinal marrow, which results afterwards serve as a regularizing or reconciling principle for the functionings of the whole common presence of each of them. Concerning the place of concentration of this localization, which serves the common presences of terrestrial three-brained beings as a regularizing or reconciling principle, it must be noticed that in the beginning, these three-brained beings of the planet Earth who have taken your fancy also had this third concentration, similarly to us, in the form of an independent brain localized in the region of their what is called breast. But from the time when the process of their ordinary being existence began particularly sharply to change for the worse, the nature there, by certain causes flowing from the common cosmic trogoautoegocratic process, was compelled, without destroying the functioning itself of this brain of theirs, to change the system of its localization. That is to say, she gradually dispersed the localization of this organ, which had its concentration in one place of them, into small localizations of the whole of their common presence, but chiefly in the region of what is called the pit of the stomach. The totality of these small localizations in this region they themselves at the present time call the solar plexus, or the complex of the nodes of the sympathetic nervous system. And in those nervous nodes scattered over the whole of the planetary body, there are accumulated at the present time all the results obtained from the affirming and denying manifestations of their head brain and spinal marrow, and these results, having become fixed in these nervous nodes scattered over the whole of their common presence, are later also such a neutralizing principle in the further process of affirmation and denial between the head brain and spinal marrow, just as the totality of everything arising in the megalocosmos is the neutralizing force in the process of the affirmation of the protocosmos and the various shades of denials of all the newly arisen sons. And so, the three brain beings of the planet Earth are not only, as we also are, apparatuses for the transformation of the cosmic substances required for the most great trogoautoegocrat, with the qualities of all the three forces of the fundamental common cosmic triamazikamno, but also themselves absorbing those substances for transformations from 3 different sources of independent arisings, have all the possibilities of assimilating besides the substances necessary for the maintenance of their own existence, and also those substances which go for the coding and perfecting of their own higher being bodies. In this manner, those 3 source substances entering their common presences for transformation are, just as for us, a threefold kind of being food. That is to say, those substances which, on the path of the returning evolutionary ascent from the sacred ashagio protoiheri, i.e., from the last stopender of the fundamental sacred heptaparaparshinokh toward the most holy protocosmos, were transmitted with the aid of their own planet itself into definite higher corresponding supplanetary formations, and enter into them for further transformation as their first being food, which is their ordinary food and drink. But those second source substances which, being obtained from the transformations of their own sun and of all the outer planets of their own solar system, and which entered the atmosphere of their planet through the radiations of the latter, entered into them again, just as into us, also for further evolutionary transformation as the second being food, which is there as they there say air, by which they breathe. And these substances in their air just serve for the coding and maintenance of the existence of their second being bodies. And finally, the first sourced substances, which for them as well as for us are a third kind of food, serve both for the coding and for the perfecting of the higher being body itself. Well then, it was in relation to those sacred cosmic substances that those sorrowful results occurred among your unfortunate favorites, which flowed and still continue to flow from all the abnormalities established by them themselves in the ordinary process of their being existence. Although the substances also of this higher being food continue to enter into them also until now, yet they enter, particularly into the beings of the present time, already only spontaneously, quite without the participation of their cognized intention, and only as much as is required for the transformations proceeding through them necessary for the purposes of the common cosmic trogoautoegocratic harmony, and for the automatic continuation of their species demanded by nature. When the abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence were finally fixed there, in consequence of which there have disappeared from their essence both the instinctive and the intentional striving for perfecting, there not only disappeared in them the need of conscious absorption of cosmic substances, but even also the very knowledge and understanding of the existence and significance of higher being foods. At the present time there, your favorites already know only of one, the first being food, and they know about that only because in the first place, even without their wish, they could not help knowing about it, and secondly, the process of its use there has already become for them also a vice, and occupies an equal rightful place alongside other of their weaknesses, which are gradually crystallized in them as consequences of the properties of the maleficent for them organ kundabuffer. Up to this time, not one of them has yet even become aware that in this first being food there are substances necessary almost exclusively only for the maintenance of the existence of their coarse planetary body alone, which is a denying source, and that this first being food can give almost nothing for the other higher parts of their presence. As for those higher cosmic substances, of which a certain quantity must, as I have already said, necessarily be transformed through them for the continuation of their species, and for the maintenance of the general harmony of the common cosmic ansanbaluaziar, your favorites at the present time have no need at all to trouble their inner God self-calming about it, since this is already done in them, as I have already said, quite spontaneously, without the participation of their own cognized intention. It is interesting, however, to notice that in the beginning, namely, soon after the destruction of the functioning of the organ kundabuffer and the 3 brain beings breeding on this planet of yours, they also became aware of these 2 higher being foods, and then began to use them with cognized intention, and certain beings of the continent Atlantis of its latest period even began to consider these same processes of the absorption of these higher being foods as the chief aim of their existence. The beings of the continent Atlantis then called the second being food Amarlus, which meant help for the moon, and they called the third being food the sacred Amarhudan, and this last word then signified for them help for God. Concerning the absence in the psyche of your favorites of a cognized need for absorbing these higher sacred cosmic substances, I wish also to draw your attention to one very important for them sorrowful consequence flowing from this, and namely, in view of the fact that in view of the fact that in them, together with the cessation of the intentional absorption of these definite cosmic substances necessary for the arising and existence of higher being parts, there disappeared from their common presences not only the striving itself for the perfection, but also the possibility of what is called intentional contemplativeness, which is just the principal factor for the assimilation of those sacred cosmic substances. Then from that time on, in order to guarantee that the required quantity of those substances might enter into them and be assimilated, nature gradually had to adapt herself to arrange that for each of them, in the course of their whole process of existence, such unexpectedness should occur already by themselves as are not at all proper to occur to any three-brained being of our great megalocosmos. Unfortunately, nature there was compelled to adapt herself to this abnormality, so that owing to these unexpectednesses, certain intense being experiencings and active deliberations might proceed in them automatically, independently of them themselves, and so that owing to these active deliberations, the required transformation and assimilation of these necessary sacred particles of the higher being foods might automatically proceed in them. Now, my boy, as for the processes themselves of the transformation in the evolutionary and involutionary movements of all these cosmic substances by means of just such apparatuses of the most great common cosmic trogoautoegocrat, as all your favorites are also, then those transformations proceed in them, as well as in us, and in general in all large and small cosmoses of our common megalocosmoses, strictly according to those two same chief fundamental cosmic laws, namely according to the sacred heptaparaparshinokh and the sacred triamazikamno. Before talking to you about the manner in which the cosmic substances entering into beings as their first being food are transformed in them for the purposes of the common cosmic trogoautoegocratic process, and which enter into three-brained beings, if they have a certain kind of attitude towards this process, also for the coding and the perfecting of their own higher parts, it is necessary for you to bear in mind, for a clear representation of these processes, that in our megalocosmos, from results which have already flowed from every kind of trogoautoegocratic process, there are many hundreds of independent active elements with various specific subjective properties which take part in new formations. These many hundreds of active elements with various properties, wherever they might be, proceeding from the 7 stopenders of the fundamental common cosmic sacred heptaparaparshinokh, are depending upon the stopender from which they receive their primordial arising, divided and localized according to what is called the affinity of vibrations, into 7 what are called heptaparaparshinokh classes, and all without exception of both the large and small already definite concentrations in all our megalocosmos are formed from these active elements belonging to 7 independent classes, and as I have already told you, they have their own subjective properties. And these subjective properties of theirs are likewise what are called proportions of vivifyingness, are actualized firstly according to what form of functioning of the first stopender of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh was flowing during their arising, and secondly, whether the given active elements arise owing to the conscious intention on the part of some independent individual, or whether they arose automatically, merely owing to the second grade law called attraction and fusion of similarities. Well then, these same many hundreds of definite active elements belonging to 7 different heptaparaparshinokh classes, and having 7 different subjective properties, among which the properties of vivifyingness and decomposition have supreme significance, compose in their totality the fundamental common cosmic ensemble by which the most great cosmic trogoautoegocrat is actualized, the true savior from the law conformable action of the merciless Hieropas. It is necessary to tell you also that the first appearance of every kind of concentration from the theomertmalogos, which is found everywhere in the universe owing to the second grade cosmic law, the attraction and fusion of similarities, proceeds in the following manner. If particles of theomertmalogos, which are already found in the different spheres of all 7 stopenders of the fundamental common cosmic ensemble, collide for some reason or another, they begin the arising of all kinds of crystallizations, which do not yet have any subjective properties. And furthermore, if these particles of theomertmalogos fall for some reason or other into conditions where a process of harmoniatsnell proceeds, they fuse into one, and owing to the what are called complex vibrations acquired in them are transformed into active elements already with definite specific properties. And if thereafter these already definite active elements with their own specific subjective properties enter into other processes of harnal-miatsno, which have other conditions, they again fuse with each other according to the same law of affinity of vibrations, and thus acquiring other properties are transformed into active elements of another octapanatsaknian class, and so on and so forth. And that is why there are in our megalocosmos so many independent active elements with their different specific subjective properties. And if now, my boy, you satisfactorily grasp the succession of the process of transformation of cosmic substances by means of being apparatuses, into which these cosmic substances enter as first being food, then at the same time you will approximately understand everything concerning the chief particularity of the sacred law of heptaparaparshinokh, as well as the processes of evolution and involution of the other higher being foods, when these evolving active elements, in their returning ascent from the last stop-ender of the fundamental common cosmic sacred heptaparaparshinokh, enter into the common presences of being apparatuses as their first being food, they begin already from the mouth itself, with the help of the process of the second grade law, harnal-miatsno, that is, owing to mixture and fusion according to the affinity of vibrations, with the active elements which have already evolved in the presences of the beings, and have acquired vibrations corresponding to the subsequent stop-enders of the being heptaparaparshinokh, to be gradually changed, and are transmuted this time in the stomach of the beings into definite active elements named being trogoautoegocrat, which correspond in their vibrations to the ascending fourth stop-ender of the fundamental common cosmic heptaparaparshinokh. From there, this totality, which is the gravity center vibration of being trogoautoegocrat, passing, thanks again only to the process harnal-miatsno, of the whole of what is called the intestinal tract, and gradually evolving, completely acquires in consequence corresponding vibrations, and is this time completely transmuted in what is called the duodenum into being diphthoriohairy. Further, a part of these definite substances of being diphthoriohairy go to serve the planetary body itself, and also the local harnal-miatsno in respect of the newly entering food, but the other part, also by means of a process of harnal-miatsno of a local character, continues its independent evolution and is ultimately transmuted in beings into the still higher definite substances, which are called this time being trogoautoegocrat. And this totality of cosmic substances temporarily crystallized in the cosmic presences of beings apparatuses, which correspond in their vibrations to being trogoautoegocrat, have as the gravity center place of their concentration in the presences of beings the what is called liver. It is just in this place of the beings Ansan Baluazar that the lower medallion of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh is located, called the mechano-coinciding medallion, and therefore the substances of the being trogoautoegocrat cannot, only owing to the process of harnal-miatsno, independently evolve further. Well then, owing to that exchange in the general functioning of the primordial common cosmic sacred law of heptaparaparshinokh, this totality of substances named being trogoautoegocrat can, in the given case, evolve further from this state only with the help of forces coming from outside. That is why in this case, if this totality of substances of being trogoautoegocrat does not receive foreign help from outside for its further evolution in the common presences of the beings, then both this totality and all the definite centers of gravity of the being and Sanbaluazar crystallized up to it always evolve back again into those definite cosmic crystallizations from which they began their evolution. For this help coming from outside, great nature in the given case most wisely adapted the inner organization of beings in such a manner that the substances which had to enter into the common presences of beings for the coating and feeding of their second being bodies question, namely, that totality of cosmic substances which your favorites call air, might at the same time serve as just such a help coming from outside for the evolution of the substances of the first being food. The active elements which compose this second being food or air, and which enter into the presences of beings also for evolution through the second being food, beginning from the nose of beings, gradually evolve with the cooperation of various processes of harno of local character, and are also transmuted this time into what are called lungs of beings into protoiheri, but into protoiheri called astronomian protoiheri. And then the substances of this astronomonian protoiheri entering into the presences of beings for their own evolution, and having still in themselves, according to the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, all the possibilities of evolving from their centers of gravity by the process of harno alone, mixed with the totality of substances of the first being food, which have already evolved up to the third stop-ender of the sacred being heptaparaparshinokh, and further evolve together, and thus help these substances of the first being food to pass through the lower mechano-coinciding model and to be transmuted into other definite substances, into being Tatariahari and the astronomonian protoihari itself is transmuted into the substances named astronomonian deftoriahari. At this point in my explanations, you can have one more clarifying example for a full understanding of the difference between autoegocrat and trogoautoegocrat. That is, of the difference between the former maintaining system of the existence of the Sun Absolute, when the system was autoegocratic, and the other system, now called trogoautoegocratic, which it became after the creation of the megalocosmos. If the transformation of the substances through beings' apparatuses proceeded according to the law of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, when certain of its stop-enders were not yet exchanged, that is, as it still functioned before the creation of our now existing megalocosmos, then the cosmic substances composing the first being food, entering into such apparatuses cosmoses for the local process of evolution, would accomplish their ascent up to their completing transmutation into other higher definite active elements without any obstacle and without any help coming from outside, merely by the process of harno alone. But now, since the independent functioning of this primordial sacred law has been changed into a dependent functioning, the evolution or involution in its changed stop-enders must always be dependent upon external, extraneously caused manifestations. In the given case, the extraneously caused help for the complete transmutation of cosmic crystallizations through beings into higher crystallizations is the second being food, which has entirely different causes of its arising, and which must actualize entirely different cosmic results. I will some time later explain to you in detail how the transformation of the substances of the second and third being foods proceeds in beings, but meanwhile note only that these higher cosmic substances and beings are transformed according to exactly the same principles as the substances of the first being food. Now we shall continue to investigate just how, according to the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, the further completing process of the transformation of the substances of their first being food proceeds to the presences of beings' apparatuses, and so the ordinary first being food is thus gradually transmuted in beings into definite substances called being tatartoiheri, which have in beings, just as, of course, in your favorites, as the central place of their concentration, both of what are called the hemispheres of their head brain. Further, a part of this being tatartoiheri from both hemispheres of their head brain goes unchanged to serve the planetary body of the given being, but the other part, having in itself of all the possibilities for independent evolution, continues to evolve without any help coming from outside, and mixing again by means of the process harno with previously formed higher substances already present in the beings, it is gradually transmuted into still higher definite being active elements called pianjoiheri. And these substances have as the central place of their concentration in beings what is called cyanurinum, or as your favorites call this part of their planetary body, their cerebellum, which in beings is also located in the head. Just these same substances and beings, according to the fifth deflection of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, have the free possibility of giving, in the manifestations of the common presences of three brain beings, result not similar but opposite to each other. That is why, in respect of these being substances, the beings themselves must always be very, very much on their guard in order to avoid the undesirable consequences for their entire whole. From the cerebellum of beings, a part of these definite substances also goes to serve the planetary body itself, but the other part, passing in a particular way through the nerve nodes of the spine and the breast, is concentrated in the beings of the male sex in what are called testicles, and in the beings of the female sex in what most of your favorites call ovaries, which are the place of concentration in the common presences of beings of their being exoiahari, which is for the beings themselves their most sacred possession. You should know that this particular way mentioned is called Trinilva. Only after this are the cosmic substances which enter beings' apparatuses for the purpose of evolution, that is, for the possibility of passing the lower medelin of the fundamental common cosmic exchange of substances, transformed into that definite totality of cosmic substances, which transformation is the lot of all beings in general, and also of your contemporary three-brained beings who breed on the planet Earth in particular, for the automatic justification of the sense and aim of their existence. And this totality of cosmic substances is everywhere called exoiahari. And so, my boy, this totality of their first being food, which results from the evolution in these beings' apparatuses, corresponds with its vibrations to the last stop-ender of the being heptaparaparshinokh, and according to the particularity of the stop-ender, it enters the higher intentionally actualizing medelin of the law of heptaparaparshinokh, and in order to transform completely into new higher substances, and in order to acquire vibrations corresponding to the vibrations of the next higher vivifyingness, namely corresponding to the fifth stop-ender of the fundamental process of the common cosmic sacred heptaparaparshinokh, it inevitably requires just that foreign help, which is actualized only in the presences of three-brain beings, exclusively owing to those factors mentioned by me more than once, and which are manifested in the being part-told duty. That is, owing to just those factors which our common Father Creator Endlessness consented to foreordain to be the means by which certain of the tetrardocosmoses, as a final result of their serving the purposes of the common cosmic Iran might become helpers in the ruling of the enlarged world, and which factors also until now serve as the sole possible means for the assimilation of the cosmic substances required for the coding and perfecting of the higher being bodies, in which we at the present time call conscious labors and intentional suffering. Here it might as well be noticed and emphasized that of all the definite cosmic substances which are formed and in consequence are always present in the common presences of your favorites, they well know only this being exoiahari, which they call sperm, and even masterfully perform with it various kinds of their manipulations. And by this name sperm they give importance to the totality of the definite substances formed only in the presences of the beings of the male sex, and ignore namelessly and with scorn a similar totality of the sum of the substances which arise in the beings of the female sex. Just this same totality of substances which inevitably always arises as the final sum in the presences of all beings from their first being food, being one of the chief causes of the fact that later, when they cease to actualize being part-told duty in their common presences, and this totality of cosmic substances in consequence did not receive, according to the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, the required foreign help for their completing evolution into other definite higher active elements, it began to evolve back in them towards those crystallizations from which their evolution began. And such involutionary processes in them began from this time to serve their common presences as factors which began to engender in their common presences the data for the arising of their innumerable what they call illnesses, and thus on the one hand began to deperfect their previously established essence individuality, and on the other hand to shorten the general duration of their existence. And to your favorites, the beings of the planet Earth, particularly the beings of the present time, do not use these same substances of being exoiahari at all consciously, neither for self-perfecting nor for conscious reproduction outside of themselves, of new beings similar to themselves. And these sacred cosmic substances, formed in them in such a manner, serve either only for the purposes of the most great cosmic trogoautoegocrat, entirely without the participation of their own being consciousness and individual desire, or for the involutionary conception of a new being similar to themselves, who is without their cognized, with a distressing result for them, from the mixing of these sacred substances of the two opposite sexes, who actualize in themselves two opposite forces of the sacred triamazikamno, during the satisfaction by them of that function of theirs which has become thanks to the inheritance from the ancient Romans, the chief vice of contemporary three-brained beings. I must sadly remark that the mentioned depraved inherency already completely fixed in their common presences is for them, particularly for your contemporary favorites, already an automatically acting means of destroying to their very root even those impulses which sometimes arise in them from manifestations worthy of three-brained beings, and which evoke in them the what is called thirst for being. I repeat, my boy, besides the fact that these favorites of yours, particularly the contemporary, cease to use these sacred substances inevitably formed in them consciously for the coating and perfection of their higher being parts, as well as for the fulfillment of their being duty foreseen by nature herself, which consists in the continuation of their species, yet even when this latter does accidentally proceed, they already accept it and regard it as a very great misfortune for themselves, chiefly because the consequences which must proceed from it must for a certain time hinder the free gratification of the multitudinous and multiform vices fixed in their presence. And in consequence of this, they, particularly the contemporary beings, strive in these cases by every means to prevent with their whole presence the actualization of such an accidental, and on their part, unintentional sacred manifestation foreseen by great nature. In the last centuries there, very many among them, in whom data for all kinds of Hasnamusian properties were more strongly crystallized, even became specialists in aiding the destruction of such accidentally actualized sacred being fulfillments, and these specialists they call their makers of angels. Whereas this same being act, which for your favorites has been turned into their chief vice, constitutes and is considered everywhere in our great universe for beings of all kinds of natures as the most sacred of all sacred divine sacraments. Even many two-brained and one-brained beings of the same planet, such as for instance the beings called their hyenas, cats, wolves, lions, tigers, wild dogs, bagushis, frogs, and many others who have not in their what are called law-conformable presences any data at all which give the possibility of comparative logic, at the present time still continue, of course, only instinctively to sense this act as sacred, and manifested only during those periods which were foredesigned by great nature for the sacred sacrament, namely, chiefly at the period of the beginning of a new completing movement of that cosmic concentration on which they have their place for rising in existence. That is, during the period which three-brained beings everywhere call the Dionos of the sacred sacraments of Saruazar, and which on the planet which has interested you are called spring days. Perhaps, my boy, you do not yet know anything about the sacred sacraments of the great Saruazar? Beelzebub asked his grandson. To the question of Beelzebub, his grandson Hussein replied thus, No, dear grandfather, the details of this I do not yet know. I only know that these Dionosks are regarded among us on the planet Caritas as great holy days, and are called helping God Dionosks. And I know that for these great holy days, the Dionosks, all our beings, activus as well as passivus, prepare themselves almost from the end of the previous holy day, and that one Lunias, before the beginning of these sacred sacraments, both old and young among us cease to introduce the first being food into themselves, and various sacred ceremonies mentally give thanks to our common Creator for their existence. I also know that the last two of these solemn Dionosks are considered and called among us the Dionosks for the glorifying of the first producer of each family. And that is why, my dear grandfather, every year during these Dionosks we all remembered and talked only of you, and each one of us strove with his whole being to manifest the sincere wish that your destiny may constantly create for you those conditions of being existence which might aid you quickly and easily to bring your reason up to the required sacred gradation, and that thereby you might the sooner finish your present ordinary being existence, personally burdensome for you. With these last solemnly pronounced words, Hussein ended his reply. Very well, my dear boy, said Beelzebub. We will talk about the sacred sacrament of the Saruazar when we return to our dear Caritas. There I will explain to you sometime in detail where and how the sacred sacrament of Saruazar proceeds with the substances being exioheri for the continuation of one species, and on what occasions and in what way the mixing and subsequent results of the two kinds of exioheri are obtained. One kind is transformed for the affirming principle in those beings' apparatuses, which on our planet Caritas are the beings activus, and on your planet Earth, the beings of the male sex. And the other kind is transformed for the denying principle in those beings' apparatuses, which among us on the planet Caritas are the beings passivus, and on the planet Earth, the beings of the female sex. Come now and let us talk about these higher perfected being bodies, that is, about souls, who came on to this holy planet Purgatory, to which all my foregoing explanations have referred. And so, from the very beginning, when these higher being parts arose in this way and were perfected in beings to the required sacred gradation of objective reason, that is to say, when in accordance with the lower medallion of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, the body question was, thanks to the second being food, formed in beings, and in accordance with the higher medallion of the same sacred law, the third highest being body was, thanks to the third being food, coded and perfected. And when these completely perfected higher being parts were divided from the lower being parts, then they were deemed worthy to be immediately united with the most holy prime source and began to fulfill their divine ordained purpose. This continued so right up to that time when that terrifying cosmic event occurred, which, as I have already told you, is now called the Chutgat Latanical period. Until this common cosmic misfortune, all the higher being bodies which arose and were perfected in certain tetrardocosmoses and in their first generations were united immediately with the most holy protocosmos itself, because their common presences had already actualized results fully corresponding to it. The point is that before this terrifying cosmic event of which I am speaking, the sacred theomertmalogos, which issued from the most holy Son Absolute, was still in a pure state, without the admixture of any extraneously caused arisings whatsoever with their own subjective properties. And when this sacred theomertmalogos came into the spheres of those planets on which the sacred crystallizations arose, and from the results of the transformations of which higher being bodies were coded and perfected through being apparatuses, then these latter received their presences exactly as they had to correspond to the required conditions of existence in the sphere of the most holy Son Absolute. But afterwards, when the mentioned common cosmic misfortune occurred, on account of which the sacred theomertmalogos began to issue from the most holy Son Absolute with the admixture of subjective properties of extraneously caused arisings, then from that time these sacred cosmic arisings ceased to have the possibility of corresponding to the required conditions of existence in the sphere of the most holy prime source. And this admixture of extraneously caused arisings began to be obtained in the sacred theomertmalogos owing to the following, and I must add, unforeseen causes. When each separate, higher perfected being body becomes an independent individual and acquires in itself and its own law of sacred triamazikamno, it begins to emanate similarly to the most holy Son Absolute, but in miniature. And when many of these perfected, independent, sacred individuals had been assembled on the most holy Son Absolute, then between the emanations of these sacred individuals and the atmosphere of the most holy Son Absolute, there was established what is called a triamazikamnian contact, and those results were obtained which brought on this terrifying misfortune for the higher being perfected parts, of which I have already told you. Thereupon the action of the results of this triamazikamnian contact soon became harmonized with the already existing actions of our most holy Son Absolute itself, and from that time the sacred theomertmalogos began to issue change, but nevertheless the primary consequence of the results of this contact had already had time during a certain period to change the harmonious movement of many solar systems and to produce a disharmony in the inner functioning of certain of their planets. It was just then that there became separated from the solar system called Clarfogo, that famous planet which exists alone in space and has quite exceptional particularities, and which is at the present time called remorse of conscience. This triamazikamnian contact occurred because in the atmosphere itself of the most holy Son Absolute, various sourced unusual vibrations began, as I have already said, to issue from these higher being bodies, and to unite with the emanations of the most holy Son Absolute, and together with them also to penetrate everywhere in the megalocosmos, and to reach even to those planets on which higher being bodies were continuing to arise in beings. And these unusual vibrations began to be transformed and crystallized together with the sacred theomertmalogos, and to take part in the coding of the higher parts in the beings. And it was from this time on that these sacred arisings began to have in their presences special properties which were obtained from this, that certain manifestations of other parts of the given being in whom these sacred arisings were coded began to enter and to be assimilated in the composition of the presences of these higher parts, and to give also very unusual results, which afterwards came to be called, and are called until now, sins of the body of the soul. Just these same various results served as a cause for this, that these cosmic formations, even if they had in their perfecting reached to the required gradation of objective reason, yet they had ceased to correspond in their common presences to the conditions of existence in the sphere of the most holy protocosmos, and from that time on they lost the possibility of being deemed worthy to unite themselves with it. Well then, when this helpless position of these higher being bodies who had become independent cosmic sacred individuals perfected in reason, but who were not corresponding in their presences, first became apparent, our all-loving Creator, being infinitely just and merciful, quickly began to take all corresponding measures concerning such an unforeseen and sorrowful phenomenon. This grievous phenomenon of these sacred individuals put them indeed in a helpless position, because although having no possibility on account of those mentioned sins in their presences of uniting with the bosom of the prime source of the whole, they at the same time, having attained that gradation of the sacred measure of the reason which brings them into subjection to the second grade cosmic law named Tetsender, had lost the possibility of free existence on the surface of ordinary planets. Then among the various divine measures undertaken, there followed his decree to choose the very best planet in the whole of our great megalocosmos, specially to arrange its surface, and to leave it for the free further existence of these higher being bodies who were perfected in reason, so that in this way they might receive all the possibilities for self-purification from the undesirable elements which were in their presences. So then from that time on, this holy planet arose with the name of Purgatory, and its chief organization and governments was undertaken at his own wish by our all-quarters maintainer, the great arch-cherub Helk-Gamatios, the same great Helk-Gamatios who after the creation of the world first merited the sacred Anklad, that is, first acquired that degree of reason which alone it is in general possible for an independent individual, whatever his nature, to attain, and which is third in degree after the absolute reason of our endlessness. Although this holy planet is indeed the very best in every respect, as you have seen yourself, and everything on its exterior is exclusively of such a kind that it is always perceived by each independent individual, as I have already said, isklolunitzernernly, that is, beautifully, delightfully. Yet to those perfected higher being bodies existing there, this is of no account, since they are always deeply absorbed in their intense work in purifying themselves from those undesirable elements which have entered their presences from causes totally foreign to their individuality. In the common presences of these unfortunate higher being bodies now existing on this holy planet, perfected in reason to the highest limit attainable by ordinary cosmic individuals, there is only this single datum, which sometimes engenders in them the impulse of hope, and that is that they may at some time purify themselves and obtain the happiness of uniting with and becoming a part of that greatness which our omnipotent, all-just, common Father Endlessness actualizes for the welfare and happiness of everything existing in our great megalocosmos. Here it is interesting to notice that almost all three-brained beings arising on all the various planets of our great megalocosmos either know of or instinctively sense the holy planet Purgatory. It is only the three-brained beings arising on your planet who do not know of it. However, only most of those who arose toward the end of the existence of the continent Atlantis and after its loss did not and do not know of it. As soon as all three-brained beings of our megalocosmos, without distinction of exterior coding, acquire any degree of self-awareness, they already begin consciously or instinctively to dream of going on to that holy planet, in order later to have the happiness to become a particle of that greatness, the blending with which must sooner or later be the lot of every already arisen essence, and three-brained beings who have attained to an already greater self-awareness, already eagerly and even joyfully permit, during their ordinary being existence, for the realization of these dreams of theirs. those unpleasantnesses to their presences which proceed from the accepted privations to their planetary body, because such beings already well understand and instinctively feel that this lower being body of theirs is, in their own sacred cosmic law of triamazikamno, the indispensable source for a certain kind of denying manifestation, and as such, of course, always must and will manifest only as denying for their affirmation part, that is, that the manifestation of this lower part of theirs must obligatorily be always opposite to what is required for them by their higher being part. In other words, every wish of the planetary body is taken as undesirable for the higher divine part which is to be coded and perfected, and therefore all three center beings of our great megalocosmos constantly carry on a relentless struggle against the wishes of their planetary bodies, so that there should be formed in them, in the struggle from what is called dispute Creonian friction, those sacred crystallizations from which their higher divine being part arises and is perfected in them. In this constant struggle of theirs, the equilibrating, harmonizing principle is their second being body, which in their own individual law of triamazikamno represents the neutralizing source, and therefore the second being part always remains indifferent to their mechanical manifestations, but for all their active manifestations it always tends according to the second grade cosmic law, or decapli fata, to unite with those desires of which there are more, whether in one or the other of the two mentioned opposite being parts. As I have already said in the beginning, that is to say, before the loss of the continent Atlantis, the three brain beings of your planet too also had an approximate understanding of the holy planet Purgatory, and there even then existed several legomenisms concerning it, and after the loss of that continent certain partial legomenisms concerning this holy planet Purgatory also survived through learned beings of that time who were by chance saved and began to be transmitted there from generation to generation. But later when, in the psyche of these strange three-brain beings there, that peculiar illness of theirs, which I characterize by the words to wiseacre, began to arise, then they began their wiseacrings with the partial information which had reached them. And from this partial authentic information concerning the holy planet Purgatory, there began to be formed and to be fixed in the psyche of beings of subsequent generations data for engendering such representations and understandings as are ideally defined by a certain exclamation of our highly esteemed and comparable Mullah Nasruddin, which consists of the following being consonants: Chakratazurt. And as for those partial legomenisms concerning the holy planet, which continued to be transmitted from generation to generation through genuine initiates there, they, having reached unchanged to a very recent epoch, that is, to what is called the Babylonian epoch, also began, owing to what I call the agitation of mind, which then seized everyone and which arose in this Babylon, as I have already related to you, on account of learned beings there of new formation, who had various inherencies unbecoming to three-brain beings, to be gradually distorted and ultimately, completely, as it is said, to wither. The point is that, in spite of the fact that the initiates of that epoch were still relatively normal, responsible beings who did not easily change their ideals, as is done there at the present time by the majority of contemporary beings, just as they themselves express it, the London foo-foo clee changed their gloves. Yet, during this period, the psychosis, which seized all these strange three-brain beings of finding out at whatever cost, whether they had a soul, and whether it was immortal, was so strong and widespread that this unhealthy need of their psyche stirred and infected the minds of even the genuine initiates there, and they, having fallen under the influence of the psychosis, mixed into the legomenisms concerning the holy planet Purgatory, and handed down such a kabur chibur that the tail of our Lucifer from pleasurable emotion turned a shade of what is called the color tango. The confusion of the minds of the initiated beings of the planet Earth of that time occurred, in my opinion, chiefly because of that beautiful theory of the Babylonian duelists in which it was said that in some other world, as it were, paradise and hell exist. Just these same two expressions, namely paradise and hell, served, in my opinion, as the cause of all the subsequent twaddle. The point is that in one of the legomenisms about the holy planet Purgatory, both of these words paradise and hell were also used. I do not know whether these two words were taken from the legomenism concerning the Holy Planet, or whether they were obtained by a chance coincidence. By these same two words, the two following conceptions were expressed in the legomenism about the Holy Planet, Purgatory. By the word paradise, the magnificence and richness which are on that holy planet were defined, and by the word hell, that inner state indeed experienced by the higher being bodies who dwell there, and namely the state of constant anguish, grief, and depression. And in one of the legomenisms, the causes for this state of theirs were even explained in detail. That is, that these higher being parts or souls, having ultimately fallen after inexpressible, consciously suffering labors onto this holy planet, and having seen and understood the reality and significance of everything existing, and chiefly seeing our common Father, endlessness himself, so near and so often, have become aware that on account of the undesirable elements present in them, they are still unable to help him in the fulfillment of his most sacred tasks for the good of our whole megalocosmos. And so, those two words then, evidently, were just the causes why the poor initiates of that time, when infected by the general psychosis, imagined that the same things were talked of in that fantastic, beautiful theory of the Babylonian future Hasnamuses, but only in greater detail, and they began half-consciously to insert certain details of this fantastic theory into the legomenisms concerning the Holy Planet, and afterwards these informations, passing from generation to generation, blossomed out with the additions of these fancies, which again our dear Mullah Nasruddin expresses by the one word, Kamal Kana Tona Shashamacher. According to what I have just told you, my boy, you can in general judge what kind of understandings and representations they have at the present time there on your planet about the what are called questions of the beyond. It could truly be said that if these understandings and notions of your eccentrics about their questions of the beyond were heard by our hens, they would begin to laugh so hard that the same thing might happen to them from their laughter as happens there among your favorites, from what is called castor oil. For a being sensing and cognizing, and at the same time for a better fairy-like illumination of the meaning of these expressions, which I just used, hens, laughter, and castor oil, I must tell you about some other consequences which flowed from always the same cunning wiseacring of these favorites of yours. In this case, concerning the question of the being exioehary, the more so since the knowledge about this will give you additional data for elucidating by a concrete example certain particularities, which I have already explained to you, of the fundamental cosmic sacred law of heptaparaparshinokh. After the loss of the continent Atlantis, certain knowledge concerning the origin and significance of this same being exioehary also survived, and this knowledge also began to pass from generation to generation. And so, about 30 or 35 of their centuries ago, when after a big process of reciprocal destruction, the majority of them again began, as it usually happens there in general after these terrifying excesses, often to see reality and to be less satisfied with the conditions of their ordinary existence, it so happened that the surviving fragments of the knowledge concerning the significance of being exioehary reached in their authentic form to certain of them who had particularly strongly sensed the emptiness of their existence and who had begun to seek possibilities by which they could somehow fill up this emptiness. In these, through fragmentary yet nevertheless authentic informations, it was very convincingly indicated that by means of the substances exioehary or sperm formed in them, it was possible to perfect oneself, but unfortunately for them, there were no indications in this information which had survived and reached them, what and how precisely this had to be done. Then certain of them began to think and to strive persistently somehow to understand what was necessary to be done, in order by means of these substances inevitably formed in their presences to struggle for self-perfection. The result of these serious ponderings of theirs was that the conviction at first arose in them that this self-perfection could possibly be actualized by itself, by abstaining from the ejection from oneself in the customary manner of these substances formed in them called sperm. and certain of them decided to unite and exist together in order to convince themselves in practice whether such abstinence could indeed give the supposed results. However hard these same beings of your planet who were first interested in this question strove to get clear about this, they arrived at nothing. And it was only the second generation of them who ultimately, after long conscious observation and intensive active meditations, categorically understood that this was indeed possible, exclusively only on condition of a ceaseless fulfillment of being parktol duty. And those of them, being of the said generation as well as certain of the subsequent 2 generations who began seriously to actualize this, did indeed attain the expected results. But already the 4th generation of those beings who were first interested in this question who were followers not from essence conviction, but from a property called to imitate, which had by that time also become inherent in these terrestrial 3-brained beings, also began to exist together and to do as it were the same thing. So from that time it began, and until now automatically continues, that such followers organize themselves in separate groups and sometimes form solid sects of various denominations, and putting the same abstinence as the basis of their aim, exist together segregated. Just these same places of theirs for segregated common existence together are called their monasteries, and the separate beings belonging to these sects monks. At the present time, very many of these monasteries exist there, and these innumerable monks who enter them do indeed strictly abstain from the ejection from themselves in the customary way of the being exioheri or sperm formed in them. But of course, no sensible result at all is ever obtained from this abstinence of theirs, and it is not obtained because the thought has ceased even to enter the heads of these unfortunate contemporary monks that although it is indeed possible, by means of these substances exioheri formed in them, to perfect themselves, yet this can proceed exclusively only if the 2nd and 3rd being foods are intentionally absorbed and consciously digested in one's presence. And this is possible exclusively only if all the parts of one's presence have been accustomed beforehand consciously to fulfill both sacred being parktol duties, that is, to fulfill conscious labors and intentional sufferings. It is, however, unjust to say that no sensible result at all is obtained among these monks there. There are even obtained among them sensible results of 2 independent kinds. So that you may understand why these mentioned 2 independent kinds of results are obtained among the contemporary abstaining monks, I must repeat to you once again that, according to the fundamental cosmic sacred law of heptaparaparshinokh, if everything in general existing in our megalocosmos, the great as well as the small, does not receive in the process of evolution at the time of its passing through both medallions of the sacred heptaparaparshinokh, corresponding foreign help coming from outside, then it begins to evolve back to those definite states from which it began its evolution. The same, of course, proceeds with the definite cosmic substances which are formed in the presences of these same terrestrial abstaining monks. And so, my boy, in consequence of the fact that these terrestrial monks, particularly the contemporary, do not intentionally aid the further evolution of these substances inevitably formed in them from the constant use of the first being food, that is, do not actualize any being parktol duty at all in their common presences, either intentionally or even automatically, and at the same time they do not remove these substances from themselves in the normal way foredesigned by nature. Then these substances begin to involve in them themselves, and during this involution of being exioheri or sperm, there is worked out, among the many transient definite substances which are in general formed in their common presences by such an involutionary process, a definite transient substance which has the property of having 2 kinds of action on the general functioning of the planetary body of a being. The first kind of action of this definite substance consists in this, that it promotes the depositing of superfluous what is called karatsyag, or as they call it, their fat. And its second kind of action promotes the arising and the dispersing over the whole planetary body of what are called poison-ionoskirinian vibrations. The consequence of all this is that in the first case, these terrestrial abstaining monks became extraordinarily, as it is usually said, their fat. And sometimes one indeed meets among these fat monks specimens with which such an abundant deposit of fat that they could give many points to that form of being there, which they expressly fatten in order to increase this same fat in their planetary bodies. And this form of being they call their pig. And in the second case, on the contrary, these abstaining monks become, as it is also usually said there, meager thin. and the action of the poison-ionoscarinian vibrations which penetrate through them is chiefly evident in their general psyche, which become sharply dual, and the manifestations of which are divided into two diametrically opposed kinds: the outer, visible and for show, sensed by everyone around them, and the inner and hidden, which the ordinary beings there, especially the contemporary, are entirely incapable of ascertaining or perceiving. Namely, in their outer visible manifestations, these poison-ionoscarinian monks appear to be what your favorites would express as bigots of a high degree, and in their hidden inner manifestations, not shown to others, what your favorites would call expert cynics, also of a high degree. As regards the causes why poison-ionoscarinian vibrations are obtained among certain of the abstaining monks from the involutionary process of the exioheri instead of the deposit of fat, there even exists one very detailed theory there about this, worked out by certain, as they are called, Catholic monks, who, several centuries ago, proved in great detail that this proceeds because in the first year of their existence, these same thin monks very zealously occupied themselves with that occupation from which pimples, known even to medicine there, generally appear on the faces of young beings there. For a full representation and understanding concerning the significance of this kind of abstinence among contemporary being monks there, it remains for me to add that of which I became convinced during my last sojourn there among them, and namely, that already, thanks only to those consequences flowing from the involutionary process of the exioheri, the fixation of various consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer in the common presences of these unfortunate terrestrial abstaining monks has become greatly facilitated and has in consequence increased. At this point in his narrative, Beelzebub was interrupted by a ship's servant who gave him a letuchambros, which he put to his ear and began to listen to its contents. End of Book 2. I'll probably do a commentary video, but I think I probably want to read through it again before I add my commentary. But a lot of thoughts were popping up as I was reading it, for sure. I would love to have like a larger version where I can write in the margins comfortably, or I may just write my own personal journal to this someday, personal guide or whatever. Yeah, that was good. I can't really think of any other books that I could just sit and read for 2 hours. It gets the brain, like the words just start to automatically come out, and in a way it is sort of a meditation where I could sort of feel myself like looking at myself and the words just being read, and it was like I didn't have to do anything, they were just read. So that was cool. And to anyone who made it to the end of this, congratulations and thank you. Okay, see you soon.